So when we think of the effort that all of the Buddhas have put in to attain full awakening, it's quite amazing. If you think of 3 countless great eons according to the Parinirvana, and shorter for the Vajrayana, but still requiring a lot of work, and that they did this for the benefit of sentient beings. And so when we look at the mind of a fully awakened one, who do they cherish most? It's very clearly sentient beings, not themselves. Yeah, they've completely replaced self-concern with cherishing others. So we respect the Buddha, we honor the Buddha, we praise the Buddha's virtuous qualities. And yet the way we treat the beings that he cherishes the most, on account of whom he exerted so much effort to become fully awakened, we don't treat those beings so well. We compete with them, we get jealous of them, we are prideful over them, on and on. And yet these are the very beings that the Buddha cherishes more than himself. So doesn't that seem rather strange that we honor and respect and love the Buddha, and yet the ones who the Buddha cherishes more than himself, we don't care much about? Our attitude doesn't seem to fit. Something seems strange. You would think that we would honor and respect sentient beings because they're the ones who the Buddha cherishes more than himself. Because they're the ones that the Buddhas, all of the Buddhas, work so hard to be able to benefit. So it's good if we spend some time thinking about it and check up if our attitude really makes sense. And especially if we harm other sentient beings, isn't that just about tantamount to harming the Buddha? Because that's who the Buddha cherishes. So I think we need to think deeply about this and really see if our attitude towards other sentient beings is suitable or not, is in line with reality or not, or if our attitude towards sentient beings is really skewed. Because we want to be like the Buddha. And the Buddha sees sentient beings as in beauty. And we look at sentient beings and think, oh, those idiots. So it's almost as if we're saying the Buddha is not seeing sentient beings properly. That we're seeing how they really are, and the Buddha's whitewashing them. That the Buddha doesn't know reality very well. It's almost as if we're saying that, isn't it? If we look at other sentient beings with a very bad view, though if we think the Buddha sees reality, even on a conventional level, and he sees sentient beings as endearing, then isn't that the direction we should steer our own mind? And if we want to become like the Buddha, and the Buddha worked so hard for so long to benefit sentient beings, then shouldn't we adopt that same attitude and follow his example? So imagine for a moment seeing sentient beings in beauty. Just drop the attachment, the anger, the competition, the jealousy, the pride. Just drop it and imagine what it would be like to see all sentient beings as quite lovable and endearing. And then think that we will do as the Buddhas have done and purify our mind and realize the teachings so that we can benefit them in the same way the Buddha does. And let's make that our aspiration for being alive. Okay, so we're on the part about the development of Tantra. So it's important to remember that we're just getting a little bit into the history, and that everything that we're learning about the different traditions, it's all developing over time. Yeah? So we kind of, come into Buddhism and we learn this whole structure, and then we think, okay, because I was thinking a little bit about your question about Tantra that you asked last week, and and we think, okay, the teachings in Sri Lanka. Back then, when we were reading when Ashoka's son and daughter came, well, everything was just like it is now. Yeah? And they practice the same way now as they did then, and the precepts were the same, and the canon was the same. No. Okay? It started out, just with a few monks and nuns. It developed over time. We heard this whole thing about, the 3 monasteries and the king's favorites and, all of this stuff. So similarly with, when Mahayana began to be more widespread, it wasn't exactly like it is now in the Tibetan tradition or in the Chinese tradition or in the Japanese tradition. Yeah, all these things developed over time, and then as they spread to different countries, we have different influences going on. Yeah, so similar with Tantra, it wasn't, it wasn't practiced then in the way it is now. I don't think they had big assemblies of 10,000 people where somebody gave the Kala Chakra initiation. Yeah, that just wasn't done. There were just small groups of people, extremely quiet, There was a hidden thing, which is the way it's supposed to be. And it's just exploded now. It's no longer hidden at all. You can go to your local bookstore and you find teachings on the completion stage, readily available for people who have no clue even what the 5 precepts are. Yeah. So, how things existed then and how they were, at 1 century BCE and 1 century, CE and 5 centuries, and everything was evolving and changing, and things were interacting. The Buddhist texts were interacting with each other. They were interacting with everything that was going on in the country, with different social movements, different religious movements. Yeah. So, why do we have the usual argument that we have, sound is impermanent because it's the product of causes? Why is that the big example that's always used? Yeah. It's not because I don't think the Buddha said that. It's because that was the belief of the Brahmins and the people who followed the Vedas. And so the Buddhists were, establishing themselves as their own philosophy, and they weren't like those people. So they took one of the most cherished principles of the Brahmins, that the Vedas, is it Vedas, Vedas? I can never say it properly. Vedas, it's a long A, Vedas. Okay, so that the Vedas were... this was one of their most cherished things, that their sound was permanent in the universe. And so, that's why it's something that the Buddhists talk about. Yeah. If Buddhists had been in a different culture, that had different beliefs, then the syllogism would have been different. It would have fits something else, And why did they develop their logical system the way they did? Well, it was in relationship to all the other non-Buddhist groups that were developing their systems of logic and debate at that time. Okay? So it isn't like, there was one kind of, okay, here's Mahayana, and it's all in this box, nicely packed, everything systematized, everything completely making sense, no contradictions at all, and you get it in the box, and then you just take it out, and everybody gets the same box and practices it the same way. No. Yeah? I mean, you just look, even in one country, the way Buddhism is practiced is so different among different traditions within one country. Okay? I mean, even if you look in Tibet, the Nyingmapas, their canon is different because they have all these old tantras, and they don't have the new tantras in their canon. Okay? So the new transmission school, they have their own canon that's slightly different than the Nyingma canon in that way. Okay, and then you look, and that's all different than the Chinese canon, and just different from the Pali Canon, and yet they're all Buddhist teachings, and they were all in the process of evolving over time. Okay. Yeah, I mean, the robes, you take our robes, this isn't exactly what the Buddha wore. Yeah. I always marvel, in the pictures of the Buddha, very often, some of the garments, the inside of the garments are blue. I wonder about that. How come they're painted blue? Because they were supposed to be saffron color. But what color is saffron? If you look at the threads of saffron, there's so many different colors. Yeah. And so, yeah, the pattern of the robes is very similar. If you look at the Japanese, what's it called? The geisha? Whatever it's called. You know, the kind of bib, rakshu, the bib-like one. Rakshu. Anyway, that garment, it's stitched very similar to the way our chugus, or maybe it's our namjars are. And you know, there's you can see, we did a fashion show one time in our Western Buddhist monastic gathering, and everybody explained their robes, and you could really see the principle was all the same. But when you looked at it, it was, you know, it looked very, very different. You know, the Zen that we wear, that's not one of the robes that was worn at the time of the Buddha. Okay, that's a Tibetan design. The Donkas, Tibetan design. Yeah. So, so we always have to remember things are evolving. They exist within societies. They're changing. You even look now, as long as we're talking about robes, you know, we're changing the style of the robes here, you know. We're putting a waistband on them instead of having a belt. Yeah. So a waistband with elastic. Yeah. Wow. That's definitely an improvement. Huh?
Doesn't work for men. We're not shaped that way.
Oh.
Like to fall down.
No, if you make the elastic tighter, it'll stay up. But you can wear a belt if you want to. That's okay. Okay. Well, donkas aren't shaped for women either, so. Yeah. So, you know, you can see that things are not static. Yeah. So things are descended from what the Buddha said, and everybody's trying to follow how the Buddha set things up. But everybody follows it, you know, kind of in their own way, making adaptations according to where they live. Yeah. Okay. So, like we were talking about last night, the way we're sitting. Okay. So maybe we should try that one time. No chairs, no tables, no notes. Yeah. And you just come in my bedroom, I sit on the bed, and you just all sit on the floor. No cushions. You can't sit on a cushion either. And if you want to do it the way the Tibetans are doing it, then like that. Yeah. Then nobody will come to teachings. Oh, I need a cushion. Okay. But there's no cushions.
Yes, she doesn't usually do cushions.
Oh, okay.
But on camera.
Okay. So, yeah, let's keep all of this in mind. Okay, so the development of Tantra. The teachings of Buddhist Tantrayana were practiced and passed down in a circumspect and private way until the 6th century, when they became more widespread. But even when they were widespread, it's anything like it is now. Yeah. Because just, like I was saying, you know, you don't have 10,000 people going for Kala Chakra initiation back then. We have to remember that, you know, they didn't have microphones. So all the teachings had to be given to a comparatively small number of people, and everybody had to sit up close because otherwise they couldn't hear. Yeah? By the 9th century, okay, so they started becoming, they were very private until the 6th century. Then they became a little bit more widespread. By the 9th century, tantric studies were recognized as a scholarly discipline. However, the tantric practitioners were not allowed to practice at the big monasteries, because we have that story, remember, of Virupa, I don't know. Anybody remember offhand? Somebody want to look up Virupa's dates? I can't remember them. Virupa. And he was at Nalanda, and they heard women's laughter in his room. And the abbot went in, and there were these dakinis in there. And, the abbot kicked Virupa out of the monastery because he said there's a rule you can't have women, in your room. So you leave and the women leave, and that was it. Okay. So, they weren't allowed to practice Tantra there in the, and yeah, did you get the dates?
9th century.
9th century? Oh, he was late. Yeah, that's really late. Okay. He's the lineage lama for the Sakya tradition in Tantra. Mm-hmm.
Was he a layperson?
Well, he was a monastic when he was at Nalanda. But by and large, a lot of the tantric practitioners were lay. Yeah. Naropa was a monk. I don't know if he disrobed after he left the monastery and started following Tilopa, but he was doing some pretty outrageous things. Yeah. Tilopa had Naropa. Just the Tibetans love telling the stories. The stories are outrageous. Yeah. So I kind of hope he wasn't wearing robes when he did some of these things. I just remember one time. Okay. So Kyabse Sangren Vichai was teaching. This was in Los Angeles in like 1980 or something. And Geshe Gyaltsen was there. And Sangren Vichai, he loves telling stories. And so he started telling one of the stories of Naropa, and how one of the things that Tilopa had him do. And so one day there was a big wedding, and they happened to be walking by, and Tilopa said, if I had a real disciple, he would go and grab the breast of the bride. And so that's what Naropa did. Now, could you imagine that in the middle of a wedding here? Yeah. So it was things like that. So Geshe Gyaltsen loved that story, Well, the whole room just cracked up, but, these kind of naughty stories. At Nalanda Monastic University, the Prajnaparamita teachings were conjoined with tantric practice, indicating that Tantra has a firm basis in the perfection vehicle. It is not a separate teaching unrelated to other teachings the Buddha gave. So that's quite important, because many people think that Tantra is totally different, that it's its own thing that's unrelated to the fundamental vehicle, to the Mahayana, to all the other Buddhist teachings. Okay, so I guess when they were studying Tantra, because it was a scholarly discipline, then it was, done very much in the flavor of the Prajnaparamita, the perfection of wisdom. Buddhist Tantra flourished in northern India and spread to Sri Lanka, Southeast Asia, and Indonesia, where many tantric artifacts have been found. It later faded in these areas as Sri Lankan and Thai kings made Theravada the dominant tradition, and Muslims occupied and converted much of the Malay Peninsula and Indonesia. Tantra later spread to China and Tibet, and Kukai introduced it in the 9th century into Japan, where it became known as the Shingon school. Buddhist Tantra was introduced in Tibet. It never really took off, not in Tibet, in China. There was a tantric school, but it never really took off because Chinese culture, was very staid and proper, and, these kind of tantrikas doing all sorts of strange things did not go over very well in Chinese culture. So it's very interesting. There, in the 20th century, the first part of the 20th century, like in the 1930s, there were several young Chinese who went into Tibet to study Buddhism and then came back. This was part of the effort to kind of modernize and Chinese Buddhism and expand its, what it had available for people to practice. So they sent people to Sri Lanka and to Tibet and Japan, and this was one of the missions. Anyway, so some of them came back. So one of the great ones that I was mentioning before, Venerable Fatsun, he was an incredible translator and, translated all these Tibetan works into Chinese. Really amazing person. I wish I could have met him. And then there was another one, Venerable Ninghai, who came back, and he established a monastery and started training monastics, and he had learned Tantra in Tibet, and so he was teaching Tantra in his monastery, like in the 1940s and so on. But he didn't teach the whole idea of consort practice, and I think even visualize consort practice. He didn't think that could possibly be something that the Buddha had taught, and so although he taught Tantra, he left that part out, So, so this is just an example of how things evolve and they change according to the culture. Yeah. And look, we have Avalokiteshvara. If you see the statues of what Avalokiteshvara looked like in India, and then what he looked like, or she, he turned into a she in China, Yeah. You have male and female Kuan Yins in China. And then in Tibet, so, the depictions are different because, something to do with the karma of the people, the culture that they were in. Some people think that Tara was that Kuan Yin came into, the idea of Kuan Yin came into Tibet, and they made it a separate deity from Avalokiteshvara, and that's how Tara arose. This is what some of the academics say. So, so it's just, we don't know, but, I'm just trying to give you a sense of how there's development and change going on. Okay. It's very interesting with the Shingon school in Japan. There's practices that they do with Tantra that are very similar to what we do in terms of fire pujas and the instruments that you use for fire pujas. But then some of the setup is different. Yeah, the way they set it up for the fire puja and things like that. So again, Tantra in there and Tantra here, and
In China today, there are tantric practitioners, but that is not the same as we know.
I don't know how many tantric practitioners there are now. I don't know what happened with Venerable Ninghai's temple in the Cultural Revolution. Yeah.
We have been at the ordination. They did a tantric ritual at the very end with the elements at our ordination. So I didn't know what they actually did. They had the hat on. And
yeah. They wear the 5 Dhyani Buddha hat, Mm. Yeah, they had dorjes. Did they have bells too?
Yes.
Okay. So now it would be interesting to ask if they called that Tantra or not. Yeah. And to find out exactly what they were doing. Yeah, because I remember that too from my ordination. What?
When I was at Shilai Temple, after they finished ordination, they started that major ceremony, earth.
Earth, water, yeah.
And
that
they
one.
also had the instruments there.
Yeah. Yeah. But that's an interesting ceremony, you know, because it's a major one in Chinese Buddhism, but we don't really have anything comparable in Tibetan Buddhism. Yeah. And yet some of the same instruments and so on are being used. So there's a lot of places where we can ask questions and learn. Put it on the list for when we go. Yeah. Okay. We also have to remember that at that time there was Hindu Tantra too. So Buddhist Tantra was also existing in relationship to Hindu Tantra. Yeah. And they have some common practices and some very, very different practices. And the philosophy behind them is completely different. Yeah. But nowadays, many people confuse Buddhist Tantra and Hindu Tantra. Yeah. Okay. Since Tantra's public dissemination coincided with the time that many Buddhist scriptures were being brought to Tibet, Tantra became very popular there. However, Buddhism was already well established in China at that time, so the Chinese Tantric school did not become widespread. Hinduism and Jainism also have Tantric adepts, although their Tantric systems differ considerably from Buddhist Tantra, which is rooted in the Four Truths, refuge in the Three Jewels, renunciation of samsara, bodhicitta, and the wisdom realizing emptiness. So you could see that the whole foundation practices, you know, that are in common with the fundamental vehicle in the Mahayana, that's what makes Buddhist Tantra Buddhist. Okay? Because Hindu Tantra, you know, they also have things with the channels and winds and drops and Tummo practice and all these, you know, these same kind of things. And I remember His Holiness once when he was talking about some of the things that Hindu Tantra and Buddhist Tantra have together, and he was saying, some of these Geshis, they would be so surprised to learn that what they're doing is just the same as the Hindus. Yeah. But of course, the philosophy is totally different, so you're going to get very, very different results. Unfortunately, misconceptions about Tantra exist due to a lack of proper information. These misunderstandings will be clarified in a future volume on Tantra in this series. I didn't want to get into all of that here. Okay, so now we're moving into a different section called Buddhist Canons. So considering the vast array of Buddhist sutras and the complexity of establishing their authenticity, it's very complex. We can understand the reasons to form canons and the difficulties involved in doing so. At present, 3 Buddhist canons are extant: Pali, Chinese, and Tibetan. Each of these has been translated into other languages or written in various scripts throughout the centuries. For example, the Tibetan Canon has been translated into Mongolian, the Pali Canon into English, and the Chinese into Japanese and Vietnamese. Each of the canons is divided into 3 baskets, or pitaka, or categories of teachings which are said to correspond to the 3 higher trainings. The Vinaya basket deals chiefly with monastic discipline. The Sutra basket emphasizes meditative concentration. And the Abbey Dharma basket is concerned with wisdom. So there's the 3 higher trainings. So when you think of, the difficulties in forming a canon, especially with something that was an oral tradition that was widespread over, big areas with no modern communication. Yeah. And then establishing a canon and really, you can see that really happened after writing became much more prominent, because the Benakas. No, I think you accent the first syllable, so Benakas. Anyway, they, would could certify the authenticity of the particular scriptures that they had memorized. But of course, if somebody memorized something wrong and passed it down, or not wrong, they just thought, oh, actually, this word fits better, or, who knows what people do? Yeah. I mean, you find it, we edit things here, and we change this word and that word and, emphasize this and de-emphasize that. And so you had those same things going on and trying to get everybody to agree which are the texts that you're going to put in. Because maybe all of the texts haven't spread throughout the whole area that you're talking about. So maybe it's just one little group in one area that got together and decided, okay, we're going to make a canon and put all these things together. But so, you have the Pali Canon like that. That happened in Sri Lanka. But that island's big, So did they have people from all over the island come together? And what about, the Theravada people that were in Indonesia at that time? Or the ones who were in India at that time? So did they have any input? And, were there some sutras that some people felt, oh yes, this must be included, this is definitely the word of the Buddha, and somebody else said, no, it can't be. Yeah, so it would be interesting, I mean, if you ever had a time machine to go back and, how do you get a bunch of human beings who think that they all have memorized everything correctly and that they have the, the everything passed down legitimately exactly as it should be. And everybody thinks that, but what they have is not exactly the same in all the details. How are that group of people going to work together to make a canon and decide what versions of what sutras to put in? So interesting, interesting to think about it, We just think, oh, there's the canon and it's written and these are how many volumes. But, think about, what did people have to do to put a canon together? Yeah. I don't think it was so easy. Then everybody having different opinions? Okay, so the Pali Canon. The Pali Canon was codified first, but as we saw above, it was not a closed canon until the 5th century, so 10 centuries after the Buddha. Its Vinaya Pitaka had 3 books that contain not only the monastic code, but also stories of the Buddha's disciples. So there is a little bit of history written into the Vinaya. Okay, so the 3 books from the Pali Vinaya, are the Sutta Vibhanka, which contains the Pratimoksha precepts, the Khandaka, which consists of 2 parts, the Mahavagga and the Kulavagga, and the Parivara, which is an appendix. So the Sutta Pitaka has 5 Nikayas, or collections of sutras, and they're listed below. We'll get to them. And the Abhidharma Pitaka consists of 7 scholastic works that are unique to the Pali tradition, even though all the other canons have an Abhidharma Pitaka too. But the scriptures are different. Okay, so the Sutta Pitaka's 5 collections, first of all, the Digha Nikaya, that's a collection of long discourses with 34 of the most extensive suttas. The Majjhima Nikaya, the middle-length discourses with 152 diverse suttas of moderate length. Now, why did they organize them according to the length of the sutras? How did they decide which suttas to put in which nikayas? Yeah, the Samyutta Nikaya are the connected discourses with 56 thematically connected sections of brief sutras, although some are very short and some are much longer, and there's a lot of repetition. The Anguttara Nikaya, numerical discourses with 11 sections, each collecting suttas with items of the same number. So you have the Book of Ones, and they all revolve around some theme that has to do with one. And the Book of Twos, which revolves, all the sutras have to do with categories that have 2 members, and 3s and 4s and like that. So it's a clever way to arrange things about the numbers. But in terms of the material, it's not necessarily going to be consistent. Yeah. Then you have the Guddaka Nikaya, which is the collection of little texts that has 15 distinct works. And then in addition to containing the sutta collections like the Sutta Nipata, So the Sutta Nipata is one part of the Guddaka Nikaya. The Guddaka Nikaya also includes the famous collected sayings such as the Dhammapada and the Udana, collections of stories of the Buddha's previous lives, such as the Jataka tales, verses or gathas of early monks and nuns. You have the Therigatha and the Therigatha, the stories of the lives of some of the prominent monks and nuns at the Buddha's time, and their teachings or their verses. You have some early commentarial works and histories of previous Buddhas in a book that's called the Buddhavamsa. Okay, so that's the structure of the Pali Canon, how it's laid out. Okay, then the Chinese Canon. Buddhism came to China beginning in the 1st century CE, about 7. I thought it started coming in the 1st century BCE. Maybe a few things came 1st century BCE and then more prominent in the 1st century CE. About 7 centuries before it entered Tibet. It entered first from Central Asia via the Silk Road, and later by sea from India and Sri Lanka. As noted above, Buddhist texts began to be translated into Chinese by the 2nd century. Many of the early translations employed Taoist terminology, leading to some misunderstandings of Buddhist thought. But by the 5th century, translation terms were more standardized, especially with the literary translations of Kumarajiva, who was one of the foremost translators. He did a lot of the Madhyamaka texts. The early 5th century also marked the translation of many more Vinaya texts, which furthered the development of the Sangha. So unlike the Tibetan Canon and the Pali Canon, which they each have their own version of the Vinaya, the Chinese Canon has, I think, 5 different versions of the Vinaya. And so this has led, it's led to a different way of thinking about Vinaya because, in the 9th century, I think it was, no, 7th century, it was earlier. The king said that we're going to use the Dharmaguptaka Vinaya is going to be foremost, okay? But whenever there wasn't something that was clearly explained in the Dharmaguptaka Vinaya, then they had the, the Mahasangika Vinaya and, the Sravastivada Vinaya and the Mula Sravastivada Vinaya and so on. And so they would look up those 10 points in the other Vinayas that often had much more explanation about a particular point that the Dharmaguptaka Vinaya had not explained well. And so it's similar if you study any of the other Vinayas, they have more explanation of some points. And, in the early years, their followers may have consulted some of the other ones. Yeah. So it's given, for the Chinese, when they, Dao Shuang was, what, 5th century? 4th century, 5th century? Maybe 6th, anyway, somewhere around there. And he was this great Vinaya master, so he based things, mostly on the Dharmaguptaka, but then, took in things from other Vinaya schools too. So the Chinese around Vinaya tend to have a much more flexible, inclusive idea about it, whereas, the Theravada, it's like, this is our Vinaya and this is how we practice it and that's it. And the Tibetans, have their own flavor of Vinaya, but and they're all Mula Sravastivada, but they come from different, there's 2 different Mula Sravastivada lineages in Tibet. But what I find is amazing is Lama Atisha, who everybody says was so great. When he came to Tibet, the Tibetans asked him not to give ordination. Can you imagine asking Lama Atisha not to give ordination? But their reason for doing it was they thought it would be better if the whole country had one Vinaya lineage, and the Mula Sravastivada, which had been introduced prior to that, and Atisha was Mahasamgika. Yeah, so they didn't want another Vinaya lineage coming in. Yeah. But I can't imagine, how do you go to Lama Atisha and tell him not to give ordination?
He agreed.
Huh?
He agreed.
Yeah, he agreed, and they had a good reason. You can understand the reason, but I wouldn't want to be the person who said that to him.
Is there any history of why people decided they didn't want to mix one Vinaya with the other?
Well, because there's slight differences here and there.
Yeah, but they tend to be slight. And some of the ones that have different precepts, it's just the wording.
Yeah, but you have to look here at the way sentient beings' minds work. Okay? And there's some people who they like things very clearly laid out. Nothing ambivalent. If we have 2 Vinaya traditions and this one says this and this one says that, which one do we use? Some people want this. Some people say, what was it we were talking about? Eating, you have to, you have to do this. And then the other school says, no, you have to do this. And then they don't get along. So they say, okay, look, rather than have any kind of disharmony, we'll only have one Vinaya school, and then everybody will follow the same way. Okay. But of course, you look in Tibet, and everybody does the Vinaya their own way. Yeah. Yeah. But they have one school. Okay. So so you really have to look, some people do not like ambiguity. Yeah. And so what's interesting in the Tibetan thing is, with Vinaya, they didn't want any ambiguity. Even though the way Vinaya is kept now, there's so much ambiguity. and the same way I was saying before, that you have people insisting on logic and reasoning, and then getting to Tantra and saying, have faith. So this is just, it's like, when they talk about Buddha teaching people with different dispositions and different interests, and people have so many different ways of doing things and thinking things. Yeah? And so how we may think and how they thought are totally different. Yeah. Actually, we can see a little bit of this happening in the country right now. You guys haven't been reading the news, but there's this, Yes. So, what's happening, I'll just tell you a little bit, because it illustrates this very well. The governor of Virginia, in his medical school yearbook from the year 1984-85, on his page, there's a picture of somebody in blackface and another standing next to a person in a Ku Klux Klan outfit. So somebody found this and they said, the governor of Virginia, look, he's wearing blackface. This is terrible. This is awful. And, the Ku Klux, somebody wearing a Ku Klux Klan, it was probably kids at, goofing off and Halloween or who knows what, okay? And so now they're finding all these college yearbooks in Virginia, in the, different countries, counties in the South, and really all this talk of how people are, were using blackface. Even, starting in the 1930s with these minstrels coming, and how racist it was, and how awful the blackface theaters were, and what their whole attitude towards African Americans. And then, the governor was, my God, that. And then the lieutenant governor, two women have accused him of sexual impropriety, and then the third guy who would take over if the first two resign, he also admitted to wearing blackface when he was 19. So so everything, the politics in Virginia, everything's totally crazy. They don't know who's leading the state, and all this stuff about blackface, and it's racist and it hurt people's feelings. But then some of the white people are saying, but it's just kids having parties. And, there was one yearbook where a bunch of boys put on blackface and wigs, and they pretended to be the Supremes, and somebody else was pretending to be Diana Ross. And they're saying, we did that because we respected these African American artists, but then other people are going, oh, but it's blackface and that's racist and it's horrible and it's painful to other people, and then so there's all this going on. Okay, so what's very interesting is in the South they've been doing blackface for since around 1830. And nobody's made a big deal about it, and nobody's thought much about it. I'm sure the African American community, has thought about it, and they haven't liked it at all. But nobody said anything and made a big cultural point. But now, of course, this is like verboten. Did I say that right? Verboten. Yeah. So it's verboten. My German's improving. Yeah. So you're not supposed to say that. So then what's happening is what is socially acceptable in 2019 is being retroactively applied to, college kids in 1984. And nobody in 1984 made a big deal about this, but in 2019, people are making a big deal about it. Okay, so what my whole point in all of this is not just to tell you how crazy things are, but it's the whole idea of what people consider socially acceptable changes over the years. Okay, it's not solid and fixed. Yeah, so for a long time in the South, it was socially acceptable, at least in white circles. Not in black circles, certainly. But now in white circles, it's not socially acceptable. So, so the three most important people in the state of Virginia, two of them, are threatened, are contemplating resigning for that. The other one is denied the sexual misconduct or things, but his job is up. And then they just found a Republican, the leader of the Virginia Senate, who was the editor of his college yearbook, and in his college yearbook, it was filled with racist stuff. So this is all coming out now, and the reason I'm telling you this is, like I said, to see that what was socially acceptable, at least in the white community at one point, is no longer socially acceptable. Yeah. And so people's values change and how you do things change. And it's how people see things changes over time. Because before, the white people couldn't see anything objectionable about blackface. They thought it was just, everybody know what blackface is? It's you take like shoe polish or black paint or something, and you put it over your face. You leave your eyes open and your mouth open. So kind of looking like you're trying to be African American. But the history of it is that you had these wandering minstrels who were white people. And one of them would wear blackface, but the blackface character in their kind of local theater was always portrayed as somebody who was stupid, who didn't know what they were doing. Yeah, so blackface has this connotation of being very racist and very deprecating and, disparaging towards African Americans. Yeah, but for a long time in the South, white people never talked about that, or at least in Virginia.
Virginia.
Yeah, in Georgia.
I would like to say,
I was in college in the South in the 1970s,
Uh-huh.
and it was not
It-
appropriate or acceptable
Oh.
to be acting out in blackface in that kind of way.
Oh,
It was not
even
okay.
in Halloween or doing skits in a fraternity.
No, well, I don't know about skits because I went to a women's college and sororities had been banned.
Okay, because a lot of this
somebody-
is appearing in the fraternities.
I'm sure it's in the fraternity
Yeah.
scene, but I would say that it's not just. I mean, there was not. Well, I can say that in Georgia, in central Georgia,
Uh-huh.
in Macon, Georgia, we're not talking about the big city, in Macon, Georgia, at West End College,
Okay,
it was not
okay.
have been acceptable at
Yeah.
all.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So we're not going to have a big discussion about blackface right now, okay?
That's all I can say, though. is
Yeah.
that It was not always, I mean, you can't just say that it was acceptable.
Yeah.
These guys knew what they were doing.
Okay, so it was acceptable in general.
It was acceptable in their fraternity.
Yes, in their fraternity houses. And they had these yearbooks out for a long time, and nobody said anything about the yearbooks. And now, there's all this. So I just wanted to say that to illustrate a point that we were talking about here. Okay, not to get into a discussion about blackface, okay? Or Virginia politics or, these kinds of things. Okay. But just to say, that, yeah. Okay. yeah, sentient beings have different ways of thinking, and it changes as time goes on. So in 983, the first Chinese canon was published, with other renditions following. Currently, the Taisho Shinshu Daijokyo, published in Tokyo in the 1920s, is the canon commonly used in China, Taiwan, Korea, and parts of Vietnam. I always wonder why they published it in Tokyo in the 1920s. Maybe because China had a lot of political upheaval at that time.
I think that's right, and that the translations that they did in Japan were excellent, from what I heard. I think they even translated back things.
No, they printed it in Chinese in Japan.
I got the
But
impression that some of the things that were lost in China were existent in Japan.
Yeah.
The Japanese were able to be
And this is
translated
some
back
of
and
the
translated.
discussion. Are some of those texts actually Buddha's words, or are they, how do you say the word, apocryphal, fake? You know, things that people had written later. So there's a few sutras. There's 2 Surangama sutras. One people say is legit. One people question the value of. And the Mahayana Parinirvana Sutra, you know, they question that one. There's another one. What's it called? Oh, I forgot. I'd recognize it if I heard it. But anyway, so there's some discussion, you know, about which are legit. But I think what the Japanese probably did is systematized and edited this so that they took out all the, you know, grammatical errors and typos and these kinds of things. Yeah, because they tend to be quite particular. Yeah. And I know, like the Tibetan Canons, if you've ever been when they're giving a lung, yeah, there's always a Lama giving the lung, and one of their, or 2 or 3 or 5 of their students around who are stopping and pointing out where there's a typo or an extra word or a word's been omitted or something like that. And then they correct it in their text, you know. So the Japanese probably did a lot of that work before they printed it. Do you know anything?
Tons of footnotes. in the-
Yeah, put in by the Japanese?
I think so. Like it's really hard to read. Asterisk in this version, this word appears. And so yeah, a lot of annotation work has been done on the Taisho Canon. Is what I
Yeah.
can see.
You mean after it was published?
I'm not sure when that was done. I mean, I'm always referring to the C beta digital version, but there are tons of footnotes at the bottom
Okay.
of what edition has what character here and so
Yeah.
forth.
And it's the same in the Chinese too. They'll have different versions of the same sutra. And, you know, they need to go through a lot of these things and really correct them and systematize them. So you have some Western scholars, and I think, you know, Tibetan scholars do some of that kind of stuff too. Very technical. You have to have a certain kind of mind to do that. Okay, so the Chinese canon consists of 4 sections. The first 3, Sutras, Vinaya, and Shastra, or treatises, were translated from Sanskrit and Central Asian languages into Chinese. The 4th, miscellaneous texts, were originally written in Chinese. Okay, so the Chinese have some texts in their canon that are later texts written in Chinese. Some of the Pali Canon, you have some later texts too that were written later. And in the Tibetan Canon, the whole Tengyur was, you know, the Indian commentaries. So that was all after, you know, the sutras as well. The Chinese canon is very inclusive and extensive, containing a vast array of scriptures, including the agamas, which correspond to the first 4 of the 5 Nikayas of the Pali Canon. The Agamas were translated not from Pali, but from Sanskrit sutras, mainly from the Sravastivada school, although some came from other Indian Buddhist schools. So there you really see, the commonality. And yet, people like Bhikkhu Bodhi and Bhikkhu Analayo are going in and looking at the Pali version of it and the Chinese version and comparing them and seeing where the differences are. The Chinese canon contains many fundamental vehicle sutras that were popular during this early period, but are not found in the Tibetan canon, because Buddhism came to Tibet later, and it was the Mahayana that was so popular and then Vajrayana that was so popular when Buddhism went to Tibet. It also contains a plethora of Mahayana Sutras and Indian commentaries, as well as some Tantras. But what's interesting is they don't have the works of Dignaga and Dharmakirti, or they only have like one text or something. But, that's not something that was, important or translated into Chinese. Again, because it wasn't kind of, I was talking when I was in Taiwan, I went to visit one professor, incredibly nice man, and he was explaining to me that, the whole tradition of debate, as was popular in India in the big monasteries, that wasn't suitable in Chinese culture because gentlemen weren't supposed to argue and debate. According to Confucius things, you were polite and you didn't make somebody lose face by winning the argument and so on and so forth. So the whole debating tradition, and which, so much relies on Dignaga and Dharmakirti, was not something that the Chinese were so interested in. Yeah? Okay, so many of these, I need to read the previous sentence again. It also contains a plethora of Mahayana Sutras and Indian commentaries, as well as some Tantras. Many of these are found in the Tibetan Canon as well. Yeah, so the Tibetan and Chinese canon share a lot in terms of the Mahayana Sutras. The major Mahayana Sutras are the same in the two. Initially, most of the Indian, so now talking about the Tibetan, initially most of the Indian sutras were still talking about Chinese. Initially, most of the Indian sutras were translated into Mandarin from Gandhari. Okay, so this was from Gandhari, not from Parthian. Yeah, until the 5th and 6th century, when more Sanskrit texts arrived in China. Okay, the monk Xuanzang famously traveled to India and Alanda Monastery by way of Gandhara in the 7th century and returned home 17 years later with hundreds of texts, especially from the Yogacarya school. His translations from Sanskrit are now part of the Chinese canon as well. While the majority of translations into Mandarin occurred in these earlier centuries, there continued to be active interest in and translation of valuable Buddhist text into the Song and Ming dynasties. In the early 20th century, translations were made of Buddhist scriptures from other countries, including Tibet. For example, by Venerable Fatsung and some of the others who had gone and studied in Tibet. Okay, now the Tibetan canon. The Tibetans have been collecting Buddhist scriptures from the inception of Buddhism in Tibet in the 7th century, and the Tibetan canon as we know it today took shape in the 14th century through the editorial efforts of Bhutan Rinpoche and other scholars. The first full rendition was printed in Beijing in 1411. Later editions were printed in Tibet itself, notably in Nartang in 1731 to 32, and in Derge in 1733. Although today there are multiple versions of the canon, the contents overall are very similar. The Tibetan Canon is composed of the Kangyur, 108 volumes of the Buddha's Word, although I've heard some variation, there's different versions, and the Tengyur, 225 volumes of Indian commentaries. The canon of the Nyingma tradition differs somewhat from that of the other Tibetan traditions in that it contains tantras from the first transmission of Buddhism into Tibet. The Tibetan system for translation customarily involved an Indian translator and a Tibetan translator working in tandem, which greatly improved the quality of the translations. A number of modern scholars working on these texts have observed that translations from Indian sources into Tibet are, in general, very accurate. About 24 sutras in the Tibetan Canon correspond to the suttas of the Pali Nikayas. I really want to do more research about that, okay, but this is what one Tibetan at Central University told me. And a few Sravaka vehicle sutras absent in the Pali and Chinese Canon are found in the Tibetan Canon. That's interesting. About 100 sutras in the Tibetan Canon do not have the word Mahayana in their titles and are probably Sravaka vehicle sutras, principally of the Sravastivada school. Okay, so that part, probably some overlap with the Pali, although again, different versions. About 10 or 20 sutras in the Tibetan Canon were translated from Chinese. Among these are the Sutra of Golden Light, the Maha Parinirvana Sutra. I thought that was one of the ones there was debate about. Okay, we need to check up about that one. And the Descent into Lanka Sutra, Lankavatara Sutra, and several sutras from the Heap of Jewels, the Ratnakuta collection, all of which are seminal Mahayana Sutras. Some commentaries in the Tibetan Canon, notably Kuji's commentary on the Lotus Sutra and Wangchuk's commentary on the Sutra Unraveling the Thought, the Samdi Nirochana Sutra, were also translated from Chinese. So those are, quite important works in the Tibetan tradition, that are referred to a lot that came from China, or at least translated from the Chinese. More Prajnaparamita sutras were translated into Chinese than into Tibetan, and many early sutras in the Pali Canon are not found in Tibetan. To enrich the understanding of Tibetan practitioners, it is important to translate these scriptures into Tibetan, says His Holiness. He would like more of this stuff nowadays being translated into Tibetan. Texts on the stages of the path, authored by Tibetan masters, contain much material that is found in the Pali Suttas and the Chinese Agamas, so in these early Buddhist sutras. So a lot of it, they didn't translate the whole sutra into Tibetan, but in like Vasubandha's writings, Asanga's writings, they'll have quotations from the early Buddhist sutras. Yeah, so a lot of that content that we find in the Lam Rim today from the early Buddhist sutras that are in common with the Pali tradition came into Tibet not because the whole sutra was translated, but because of quotations from Asanga or Vasubandha or, somebody else who wrote a commentary that was translated into Tibetan. Yeah. So, the stories we read in the Lam Rim, in Precious Human Life, the turtle story, that's in the Pali Canon. There's all these kinds of things that you read the Pali Canon, you go, oh, we have that same story. We have the same thing. But, it wasn't exactly like some of those sutras were translated. The Sravasti versions of those sutras were translated into Tibetan, but a lot of it came through the commentaries. Yeah, which is so interesting, I think. Yeah. Most Prajnaparamita sutras were translated into Chinese, more into Chinese than into Tibetan. Okay, so we finished that. Texts on the Stages of the Path, authored by Tibetan masters, contain much material that is also found in the Pali Sutras and the Tibetan Agamas. Chinese Agamas. Considering that not a huge number of these early sutras were translated into Tibetan, how did this material find its way into treatises authored by Tibetans? Oh, and here's what I just explained. Vasubandhu's book, Principle of, how do you say that? Exegesis? His Ada commentary on the Treasury of Knowledge, the Abhidharma Kosha Bhajya, and his 100 extracts from the Sutras and Principles of Exegesis, I won't even try and pronounce the Sanskrit, contain quotations from over 100 early sutras from different schools, including the Stavira and Sarvastivada. In addition, Samantadeva's commentary on the Treasury of Abhidharma contains many passages from a variety of early sutras, and that was translated into Tibetan. One of the biggest sources of sutra quotations in the Stages of the Path literature is Shantideva's Compendium of Training, Shiksha Samuchaya. That I don't know if he has more Mahayana Sutras or also some of the early sutras. I don't know. The Compendium of Sutras, also called the Sutra, this is Sutra Samuchaya, attributed to Nagarjuna, also has many of these citations. Furthermore, some Mahayana sutras cover the same material as do the early sutras. For example, in the Sutra of the 10 Grounds, Dasabhumika Sutra, that one I can pronounce, explains the 37 harmonies with awakening, and the commentaries and treatises by great Indian scholars, Asanga, Shantideva, and others, contain many passages from the early sutras. Nagarjuna's Precious Garland and Letter to a Friend also share much material with the Sarvastivada Sutras that are similar to the Pali Sutras. Yeah, and you can really see that, you know. It's quite interesting how, you can see that in some Mahayana texts, sometimes it's a scripture, sometimes it's a sutra. The material is so much like in the Pali Nikayas or in the Agamas, you know. So there's a lot of crossover and translations of different materials and so. In this way, many passages shared with the Pali Sutras and Chinese Agamas made their way into Tibet through the commentaries and treatises of the great Indian sages. But of course, you know, when they quoted things, they didn't always say what sutra it came from. The Tibetans are famous, and this is like so hard for me in writing the book. One sutra says, okay, or you can find this in the Heap of Jewels Sutra. Heap of Jewels Sutra is this big. You can find this in the Avitamsaka Sutra. Avitamsaka Sutra is, even bigger. Or the same size, whatever. But they don't, this thing of, verse and chapter and page number of the different editions. The early people didn't care about this. Yeah, they just, and I can't remember now some examples, but I remember reading in Precious Garland. Oh, No, I remember what it was. We have the homage to compassion in our foyer, and that homage to compassion from Chandrakirti's Madhyamika Avatara is so famous and well studied and analyzed, and it talks about, the three causes of the Bodhisattva. Actually, that's taken straight from one verse in Nagarjuna's Precious Garland. And Nagarjuna was, how many centuries earlier than Chandrakirti? But, he took the same idea and he wrote about it. And, everybody talks about him now. But Chandrakirti at his time in India was a nobody. Nobody read him. Nobody commented on Chandrakirti or critiqued him. They thought he was too far out. And it was the Tibetans that made him very well known. But again, he's not well known in China at all. Nagarjuna is. A Tibetan monarch issued a decree establishing a convention that enables readers to immediately identify which of the three baskets a scripture belonged to. Translators composed a verse of homage placed at the beginning of the text. An homage to the omniscient Buddha indicated texts from the Vinaya basket that dealt with the higher training of ethical conduct. Remember in our Posada? Yeah. Homage to fundamental teacher Shakyamuni Buddha. Okay, homage to the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas showed the text belonged to the Sutra basket. So the chanting we do about the Sutra going beyond, homage to the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. And then homage to Manjushri, the embodiment of wisdom, indicated texts from the Abhidharma basket, which deals with knowledge and wisdom. But it's very interesting that the Prajnaparamita Sutras, the perfection of wisdom, are not in the Abhidharma basket, they are in the Sutra basket. Okay. Yeah.
I don't know if you know of this, but I heard that Geshe Thupten's Pelsang has written a book that came out sometime in the last few years where he had researched all of Je Rinpoche's citations in the Lamrim Chinpo, gone into the sutras and looked for the sources of those.
Oh, really?
And he has a book in Tibetan. That it would be really so fantastic if it were in English, but that was his work for many years, was digging these out of the sutras, and so that's part of his scholarship, is understanding of the sutra sources of these things. But it's
that's
available.
very good. Wow.
Yeah, it's 2 volumes. Venerable Pema's suitcase didn't have space. I ordered it from the Library of Tibetan Books and Archives doesn't ship, right?
Oh.
So I asked Venerable Punsok to bring them whenever she can.
Oh.
She makes it here.
Who?
Venerable Punsok.
Okay.
Because it's 2 huge volumes, I think.
Ah, okay.
But all in Tibetan. So.
Yeah. Yeah, there's so much scholarship that needs to be done, and so much of it is just technical, like this. Yeah.
Someone's asking, what makes someone a Vinaya master? Is it mastery over the Vinaya text or mastery over the ethical discipline? How do you earn this title?
A Vinaya master? I think both. You have to know the Vinaya text very well, and you have to practice Vinaya very well.